Resurrected bodies. A brief history of the dead rising from the grave. The departed have walked among us. Part 1. Introduction. Understanding the concept of resurrection. The notion of resurrection, returning from physical death to life, occupies a prominent place in the mythologies, religious texts, and folklore of many cultures around the world. Historically, these tales have served as reflections of humanity's hopes, fears, and understandings of mortality. The concept may first appear in mythological stories, where gods or semi-divine heroes triumph over death, symbolizing the triumph of life or fertility over the barren forces of the underworld. Over time, resurrection stories became woven into religious narratives, shaping belief systems and influencing theological doctrines regarding the afterlife, salvation, and the power of the divine. In addition to these theological and mythological threads, historical claims of resurrection often surface at the intersection of faith and skepticism. For some, these accounts confirm the existence of miracles and the possibility of life beyond the grave. For others, they illustrate the susceptibility of communities to rumor, superstition, and the interpretive power of belief. Modern science, grounded in medical and biological disciplines, has introduced explanations that challenge more literal understandings of these tales. For instance, certain cases of resurrection might be explained by misdiagnosed clinical death or spontaneous return of pulse after cardiac arrest, sometimes referred to as the Lazarus phenomenon. This text provides a chronological exploration of resurrection stories, starting with the mythic traditions of ancient Egypt, moving through Greco-Roman mythology, biblical accounts, medieval hagiographies, and culminating in more contemporary claims. Along the way, we will endeavor to separate myth from verifiable historical claims and consider scientific frameworks that help us interpret these extraordinary stories. Though this analysis will be thorough, it is important to note that many of the sources on early resurrection claims are shrouded in legend or based on religious texts. Our goal is not to settle issues of belief, but rather to scrutinize how these stories emerged, developed, and were transmitted within various communities, and how modern historiography and science might view them. Part 2. Ancient Egypt. Osiris and the Seed of Resurrection Myths. 1. Osiris, the archetypal risen god. One of the earliest and most influential resurrection stories emerges from the myth cycle of ancient Egypt, centered around the god Osiris. The myth of Osiris was already well established by the Old Kingdom period, c. 2686, 2181 BCE, and continued to be elaborated upon into the Greco-Roman era. The core narrative involves the murder of Osiris by his brother Set, the dismemberment of his body, and its eventual reassembly and resurrection by Osiris's sister wife Isis. According to the standard narrative, Set's betrayal, Osiris, once a just king, was tricked and murdered by his brother Set. Isis's devotion. His wife, the goddess Isis, scoured the land for his scattered remains. Reassembly and resurrection. Isis magically reassembled Osiris's body. With the assistance of the god Thoth and other deities, Osiris was brought back to life long enough to father a son, Horus. This tale of death and rebirth served as a foundational myth for Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife. Osiris became the ruler of the underworld, presiding over the judgment of souls and offering the promise of eternal life to those found worthy. While Osiris's story is more mythic than historical, its importance can hardly be overstated. It introduced key themes: divine justice, the triumph of life over death, and the possibility of an afterlife. Historical and cultural context. For the ancient Egyptians, life after death was not merely a possibility, it was almost a certainty, assuming one took the right steps to preserve the body and undergo the proper funerary rites. The Egyptian mummification process and funerary texts, such as the pyramid texts, coffin texts, and later the Book of the Dead, reflected a civilization's thorough preoccupation with life beyond the grave. Osiris's resurrection thus symbolized hope that death might not be final but could be transcended through the correct religious protocols and the favor of the gods. Scientific perspective. Modern science categorically rejects the possibility of bodily reconstruction and reanimation in the manner described in the Osirian myth. Dismembered remains cannot be reassembled into a living, breathing being. The story, however, retains a potent metaphorical resonance regarding fertility, agricultural cycles, and the natural rhythms of life and death, reflecting the Egyptian environment where the Nile's annual flooding brought renewed life to the farmland, just as Osiris's resurrection heralded new life beyond death. 2. Other Egyptian deities and concepts of revivification. Osiris overshadowed other Egyptian gods in terms of death and resurrection, but certain local cults also developed resurrection-like themes. For instance, the syncretic god Serapis, from the Ptolemaic period, combined aspects of Osiris and Apis, the sacred bull, to create a deity with associations to rebirth and healing. However, none of these stories were as central or as elaborated as the Osirian myth. 3. Influence on later cultures. Egyptian ideas about the afterlife influenced neighboring regions through trade, conquest, and cultural exchange. The Greek historian Herodotus, 5th century BCE, reported on Egyptian funerary customs with a mix of fascination and reverence. In turn, Hellenistic religious movements sometimes borrowed from Egyptian notions of regeneration, though these were adapted and syncretized to fit Greek, Roman, and other local religious frameworks. Thus, from ancient Egypt's earliest recorded stories, the concept of divine or semi-divine resurrection would echo throughout the broader Mediterranean world, setting the stage for later myths, cults, and eventually, the Christian narrative. Part 3. Ancient Mesopotamia and the Near East. Tales of Return from the Netherworld. 1. The Descent of Inanna Ishtar. Across the Near East, one finds analogous stories of deities dying or journeying to the underworld and returning to life. The Sumerian goddess Inanna, later known as Ishtar in the Akkadian tradition, endures a descent into the underworld in the famous myth, The Descent of Inanna. Inanna is stripped of her clothing and power and is effectively killed by her sister, Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. Eventually, through the intervention of helpers and the arrangement of a substitute, Inanna is permitted to return. While this narrative is more about a journey and return than a clear bodily resurrection in the modern sense, it highlights the region's fascination with crossing the boundary between life and death. The cyclical nature of these myths often aligns with seasonal changes, reinforcing agricultural rhythms of growth, decay, and rebirth. 2. Baal and Mot in Canaanite religion. In the Ugaritic texts from ancient Canaan, modern-day Syria, the god Baal battles Mot, the personification of death, and is defeated, only to be revived through the efforts of the goddess Anat. This cyclical confrontation speaks to seasonal fertility themes. However, direct historical claims of real human beings rising from the dead are less prominent in extant Mesopotamian or Canaanite texts. The stories remain primarily mythological frameworks. 3. Scientific and historical reflections. Like Osiris's story, these narratives are best understood symbolically. They rarely present themselves as actual historical events, rather they serve as allegories of life's cyclical nature. From an archaeological perspective, no known evidence suggests that ancient Mesopotamians believed in actual human resurrections beyond the mythical domain. Tomb inscriptions and funerary rites imply a powerful belief in an afterlife or a netherworld, rather than a return to the mortal realm. Still, the broader conceptual threads, journey to and from the underworld, defeat of death by a deity, resurface in numerous religious traditions, including Hellenistic mystery religions, and ultimately Christian theology. Part 4. Ancient Greece and Rome, Mythic and Philosophical Conceptions. 1. Greek mythology, Asclepius, Orpheus, and Dionysus. In the Greek world, tales involving resurrection typically centered on gods or mythic heroes. A few figures bear mention. Asclepius, the god of medicine, reputedly possessed the power to raise the dead. His healing cult was widespread, and many pilgrims journeyed to Asclepian temples, Asclepiae, seeking miraculous cures. While the notion that he literally raised individuals back to life belongs to myth, the veneration of Asclepius as a healer who could restore life speaks to an early form of medical religious syncretism. Orpheus descends into the underworld to retrieve his wife, Eurydice, but fails in his quest, one of the tragic love stories of Greek mythology. This was not a resurrection per se, but the theme of mortal attempts to reverse death was clearly present. Dionysus, god of wine, fertility, and ritual ecstasy, was often depicted as dying and returning. In the Orphic tradition, the infant Dionysus Zagreus is killed, dismembered, and reborn. This cyclical pattern again resonates with agricultural renewal themes. 2. Roman adaptations and imperial cult. The Romans adapted many Greek myths into their cultural framework. While they believed in gods who could intervene in mortal affairs, direct stories of human resurrection were relatively rare. Some Roman accounts mention the improbable revival of a corpse or the ghostly reappearance of the dead, but these largely remain folklore or anecdotal. In the imperial cult, the state religion venerating emperors as divine or semi-divine, there was some suggestion that emperors could ascend to the realm of the gods upon death, apotheosis. While not a bodily resurrection, this notion implied a sort of spiritual transformation that elevated the deceased emperor to a living status among the pantheon. 3. Scientific and historical reflections. Greek and Roman writers were often skeptical of wonders and miracles that contradicted empirical observation. Philosophers such as Epicurus denied the afterlife, while the Stoics maintained a more pantheistic perspective. If a story arose about someone being raised from the dead, it might be relegated to the domain of legend or religious cult. Nevertheless, the motif of resurrection, especially in the context of fertility and seasonal cycles, remained a potent part of Mediterranean religious imagination. By the time the Roman Empire reached its zenith, a new religious movement, Christianity, would bring resurrection claims to the forefront, eventually shaping much of Western civilization's understanding of life after death. Part 5. The Early Christian Era, Jesus, Lazarus, and the Saints of Matthew's Gospel. 1. Jesus of Nazareth, the central Christian claim. Among all resurrection narratives, that of Jesus of Nazareth stands as the most influential in Western history. Central to Christian theology is the claim that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, died, was buried, and rose from the dead on the third day. This event is commemorated each year at Easter and serves as the cornerstone of Christian faith. Historical context. Sources. The resurrection of Jesus is attested in the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Pauline epistles, notably 1 Corinthians 15, and a handful of extra-biblical references from early Christian writers like Clement of Rome and Ignatius of Antioch. Historical debate. Historians vary in their interpretations. While most agree Jesus was an historical figure who died by crucifixion, the resurrection event itself remains outside the purview of strictly historical methods because it involves a supernatural claim. Cultural impact. The claim of Jesus' resurrection galvanized the early Christian community, leading to rapid growth and the eventual spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. Scientific perspective. Modern medicine does not support the possibility that a person who has suffered the extensive trauma of crucifixion and clinically died could spontaneously or miraculously resurrect. However, to believers, this event remains an article of faith and a defining miracle. 2. The raising of Lazarus and other Gospel accounts. The Gospels also recount other resurrection miracles attributed to Jesus, such as the raising of Lazarus, John 11:1-44. According to the text, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days before Jesus revived him. These accounts function theologically to demonstrate Jesus' divine power over death and to foreshadow his own resurrection. The historical reliability of these events is debated. Skeptics see them as theological constructs, while believers regard them as legitimate miracles. Regardless, these narratives profoundly shaped Christian liturgical and spiritual traditions, reinforcing the belief in bodily resurrection at the end of time. 3. The saints in the Gospel of Matthew. One of the more enigmatic resurrection accounts appears in the Gospel of Matthew 27:51-53, which describes how, at the moment of Jesus' death, tombs opened and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They are said to have come out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and appeared to many in Jerusalem. Analysis. Historical evidence. This particular event is mentioned only in the Gospel of Matthew. No other contemporary source, biblical or extra-biblical, corroborates the mass resurrection of these saints. Theological implication. The event underscores the cosmic significance of Jesus' death, suggesting that his sacrificial act extends beyond his own resurrection to inaugurate a broader victory over death. Modern perspective. Most historians, including many Christian scholars, struggle to treat this passage as literal history. It is often interpreted symbolically or seen as a Matthean theological motif, illustrating that the power of Jesus' death and resurrection was so enormous that it conquered death itself for the righteous. 4. The early Christian martyrs and saints. While direct claims of bodily resurrection in the early Christian community outside of Jesus' resurrection are rare, there are sporadic hagiographical stories of martyrs returning from death to aid the faithful, though these typically fall into the realm of miraculous legend rather than documented history. Early church fathers, including Irenaeus and Tertullian, generally argued that the resurrection awaited believers at the end of time rather than occurring widely in the here and now. Part 6. Resurrection stories in late antiquity and the medieval period. 1. Saints and miracle tales. Throughout late antiquity and the Middle Ages, Christian hagiographies, biographies of saints, frequently included miracles of healing, exorcism, and sometimes even resurrection. For example, St. Martin of Tours, 4th century CE, was credited with raising a catechumen from the dead. St. Patrick of Ireland, 5th century CE, is said in later tradition to have raised several people from death as a sign of divine favour. St. Nicholas of Myra, 4th century CE, gained a legendary aura for miraculous acts. Though not typically credited with resurrection miracles in his earliest tradition, later folk legends in the Eastern Orthodox Church sometimes expanded his miraculous repertoire. Historical critique. Often these accounts come from later hagiographical sources that sought to glorify the saint. The historical reliability is typically minimal. They were not written as objective histories, but rather as edifying tales meant to inspire devotion. No contemporary documentation outside these ecclesiastical narratives confirms or even mentions such events. Scientific perspective. Given medieval medical knowledge, it is possible that some individuals were revived from states of unconsciousness or near death, for example in diabetic coma or from asphyxiation. Such events, misunderstood by eyewitnesses, might have been interpreted as literal resurrection. 2. Medieval folklore. The undead and revenants. The broader medieval culture in Europe was also replete with stories of revenants, corpses that rose from the grave to haunt the living. These are not resurrections in the Christian sense, but rather proto-vampiric or zombie-like entities in folklore. Chroniclers such as William of Newburgh, 12th century, recorded tales of reanimated corpses, but these were almost always treated as malevolent forces, requiring exorcism or destruction. Such stories reflect medieval anxieties about death, the afterlife, and the boundary between the living and the dead. They also highlight how certain unnatural post-mortem phenomena, like decomposition producing gases that cause movements or sounds in the corpse, could feed the imagination of revenants. 3. Scholarly perspectives from the Middle Ages. Despite a prevalence of miraculous narratives, scholars of the medieval period, such as Thomas Aquinas, were more nuanced about the concept of resurrection, primarily confining the ultimate resurrection to the final judgment. So while isolated claims of resurrection might be celebrated in hagiographies, the mainstream theological stance was that definitive resurrection was reserved for the eschaton, end times. Part 7. Early modern and Enlightenment era skepticism, a shift in worldview. 1. Witch trials and folk beliefs. In early modern Europe, 16th, 17th centuries, belief in resurrection miracles continued in some local traditions, but was overshadowed by concerns about witchcraft and demonic possession. Allegations of witches raising corpses seldom referred to genuine resurrection, rather they focused on necromancy, summoning or controlling spirits and possibly reanimating bodies, at least in rumor. 2. The rise of scientific inquiry. The Enlightenment, 17th, 18th centuries, brought a more critical approach to claims of miracles, including resurrection. Philosophers and scientists like René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, and later David Hume questioned the rational basis for miracles. Hume's essay, Of Miracles, famously argued that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the falsehood of that testimony would be more miraculous than the event it endeavors to establish. Impact on resurrection claims. As scientific understanding of biology, anatomy, and medicine advanced, claims of genuine resurrection outside biblical tradition became increasingly met with skepticism or dismissed outright. Some theologians responded with refined doctrines emphasizing the symbolic or faith-based nature of biblical resurrections, rather than literal bodily revivals that could be scientifically verified. 3. Cases of apparent death and premature burial. The 18th and 19th centuries also saw a surge of fear regarding premature burial, and cases in which people believed they had encountered revived corpses. With limited medical techniques to confirm death, there were anecdotal stories of individuals awakening during funerals or exhumed coffins showing signs of struggle. These instances, while rare, might have contributed to the lore of resurrection-like events. Historical documentation. Some newspapers from the 18th and 19th centuries sensationalized cases in which individuals revived after extended periods of unconsciousness. While none convincingly matched the dramatic claims of multi-day or multi-year returns from death, they sowed confusion and fear, further illustrating that misdiagnosis could explain some resurrection stories. Part 8. The 19th century to present spiritualism, near-death experiences, and modern legends. 1. Spiritualism and seances. In the mid to late 19th century, the spiritualist movement gained momentum, particularly in the United States and Britain. While spiritualists generally did not claim bodily resurrection, they did emphasize communication with the dead. Occasionally, fraudulent mediums asserted they could manifest materialized spirits in physical form, claims that sometimes blurred the line between mere apparition and a revived body. Investigations by skeptics, including Harry Houdini, exposed many of these mediums as charlatans employing stage tricks. 2. The Lazarus phenomenon. In modern medical jargon, the term Lazarus phenomenon refers to the spontaneous return of circulation, ROSC, after cardiac arrest and failed resuscitation attempts. First documented in medical literature in the 20th century, it provides a scientific explanation for cases in which individuals were pronounced dead, only to show signs of life minutes or even hours later. Notable cases. Reports exist of patients declared dead in hospital settings who were discovered alive after staff had ceased CPR. Though extremely rare, these incidents highlight the complexities of determining death and have fueled both medical research and sensationalist press stories about modern-day resurrections. 3. Near-death experiences, NDEs. While not exactly resurrection claims, near-death experiences, where individuals report out-of-body sensations, bright lights, or encountering deceased relatives, have added a modern dimension to the debate. Psychiatrist Raymond Moody popularized the phenomenon in his book, Life After Life, 1975. Scientific perspective. Most researchers attribute NDEs to physiological and psychological processes, such as cerebral hypoxia, lack of oxygen, or neurochemical surges. However, some argue that NDEs indicate a consciousness independent of the brain, reinforcing beliefs in an afterlife or spiritual reality. 4. Modern religious movements and miracle claims. In certain Pentecostal and charismatic Christian circles, there are sporadic claims of dead individuals being raised. Evangelists in parts of Africa, Latin America, or even in Western revival meetings occasionally present testimonies of resurrections. Investigations often reveal inadequate medical confirmation of death, reliance on hearsay, or strongly faith-based interpretations of events that might have medical explanations. Despite modern skepticism, these claims persist in religious communities that embrace divine healing and miracles. The debate between faith and science in these contexts is ongoing, with documentation proving elusive. Part 9. Assessing the evidence: historical, contextual, and scientific analysis. 1. Historical reliability. Throughout history, accounts of individuals returning to life after confirmed death are exceedingly rare and almost never substantiated by reliable documentation. The earliest stories arise from mythological frameworks in which the protagonists are gods or demigods. Later religious narratives, such as those in Christianity, intertwine theological message with historical claim, making them complex to assess purely as historical data. When it comes to hagiographies and medieval miracle stories, the sources are typically written decades or centuries after the purported event, and aimed at edification rather than objective reporting. As for modern cases, documentation is often incomplete, with insufficient medical records or contradictory eyewitness statements. 2. Cultural and contextual influences. Many resurrection stories serve a didactic or symbolic purpose: validation of divine authority. In biblical narratives, the ability to raise the dead validates the power of prophets or of Jesus as the Son of God. Symbolic representation. In mythic cycles, Osiris, Inanna, resurrection mirrors natural cycles and conveys hope in the renewal of life. Community and identity. Hagiographies that recount saintly resurrections or miracles strengthen the identity and piety of a faith community. Thus, understanding these stories requires us to consider their cultural context, the intent of the authors, and the theological or social function they perform. 3. Scientific perspectives on resurrection claims. From a strictly scientific standpoint, bodily resurrection contravenes the known laws of biology and physics. Once significant cell death and decomposition set in, reversing the process is considered impossible. Yet certain phenomena complicate the picture. The Lazarus phenomenon, rare spontaneous return of circulation, can appear miraculous if not understood. Deep coma or hypothermia. Individuals in extreme hypothermia or near-drowning states sometimes survive after prolonged periods without detectable pulse, blurring lines about death. Misdiagnosis of death. Historically and even occasionally in modern times, errors in declaring death can lead to resurrection stories. 4. Faith and the limits of empirical inquiry. Resurrection narratives, especially those central to religious belief, straddle the boundary between empirical inquiry and faith-based acceptance. Science aims to describe natural phenomena through testable hypotheses, while religious doctrine often posits supernatural interventions. For believers, the resurrection of Jesus, for instance, might be a transcendental event beyond the scope of natural laws, serving as a cornerstone of faith rather than an incident to be validated through empirical evidence. Part 10. Specific cases of alleged bodily resurrection through history, a brief survey. To ensure thoroughness, let us survey a few specific lesser-known claims alongside the more famous ones. Apollonius of Tyana, 1st century CE. A Greek philosopher and miracle worker, sometimes depicted in stories as reviving a dead girl. Philostratus's Life of Apollonius presents these tales, though they are written decades after the fact and intermingle philosophy, hagiography, and legend. St. Benedict, 6th century CE. Gregory the Great's dialogues attribute miracles to Benedict, including one instance where Benedict is said to have restored life. As usual, the historical reliability is rooted in a single pious text. St. Stanislaus of Szczepanów, 11th century CE. According to Polish legend, he resurrected a dead man named Piotr to testify in a land dispute. The story is anchored in medieval legal tradition, yet not corroborated by external sources. St. Joan of Arc, 15th century CE. While she was associated with divine voices, there is no credible resurrection claim about her. However, some legends in later centuries reimagined miracles around her. She was not resurrected, but was revered as a martyr whose legacy lived on. Modern resurrection ministries. In the 20th and 21st centuries, pastors or revivalists such as Reinhard Bonnke have been associated with testimonies of individuals purportedly raised from the dead, for example, Daniel Ekechukwu in Nigeria, 2001. These claims typically involve incomplete death certification and heavily faith-based narratives. Investigative journalists and doctors have found no conclusive evidence of true biological death followed by resurrection. Final observations. Despite the pervasive allure of resurrection narratives across millennia, well-documented cases of actual bodily return to life after verified death remain non-existent under scientifically controlled conditions. Historically, these stories fulfill roles that extend beyond mere curiosity. They affirm religious or cultural identities. They embody humanity's innate struggle with mortality. They inspire hope, whether in the form of a bountiful harvest, as in the Osiris cult, or eternal salvation, as in Christianity. In modern times, medical science continues to refine definitions and diagnostics of death, diminishing the margin of error that once contributed to tales of the dead reviving. Yet the human fascination with conquering death persists, manifesting in religious faith, scientific research, for example cryonics, and popular culture, zombie films, vampire lore, etc. When it comes to the question of whether anyone, ancient or modern, has truly been resurrected from a state of complete and verifiable death, the historical and scientific consensus is uniformly skeptical outside of faith traditions. Within those faith traditions, however, the question is framed differently, rooted in doctrinal truth, and the transformative power such an event holds for believers. Thus, resurrection remains one of the most potent motifs in human spiritual imagination, bridging the gap between fear of mortality and the hope for everlasting life. Conclusion. This sweeping history of people claimed to have been resurrected from the dead illustrates a complex tapestry woven of myth, religious doctrine, folklore, and occasional medical anomalies. From ancient Egypt's Osiris through the New Testament accounts of Jesus and the saints, from medieval hagiographies to the sporadic modern-day miracle claims, each story reflects the cultural context in which it arose. In ancient mythologies, these tales often served to explain natural cycles or to reinforce the power of deities. In the Christian tradition, the resurrection of Jesus became a central event that reshaped the religious landscape of the Roman Empire and eventually much of the globe. Medieval saint stories and modern revival claims, while meeting with varying degrees of credulity, continue to spark debate and reflect the enduring human desire to transcend death's finality. Analyzed historically and scientifically, none of these claims have been unequivocally demonstrated to be true resurrections of a corpse into lasting life, at least not within the boundaries of natural laws as currently understood. Still, for adherents of various religions, the spiritual truth of resurrection can remain deeply significant, representing a cornerstone of hope and faith. Thus, resurrection narratives remain an intersection of history, theology, anthropology, and the ever-expanding frontiers of scientific knowledge. They remind us that questions of life, death, and what, if anything, may lie beyond are as old as human civilization, and perhaps as enduring as the human spirit's quest to find meaning in both the present world and any world to come. Addendum: Resurrection-like stories in India, China, and Africa. While the main text surveys many well-known resurrection claims from the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean world, medieval Europe, and modern contexts, there are indeed additional stories, both mythological and more recent, in other regions such as India, China, and parts of Africa. Though these narratives sometimes blend themes of rebirth, reincarnation, or transformation, rather than literal bodily revival in the Judeo-Christian sense, they nonetheless illuminate the global human fascination with transcending death. Below are some key examples and contexts. 1. India, between reincarnation and resurrection. A Hindu mythology and rebirth themes. India's dominant religious traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, emphasize concepts of reincarnation or rebirth rather than one-time bodily resurrection. The doctrine of samsara describes the cyclic process of birth, death, and rebirth governed by karma. Nevertheless, several mythological or hagiographical stories can appear resurrection-like. Savitri and Satyavan from the Mahabharata. In this famous tale, the devoted wife Savitri uses cunning and devotion to outwit Yama, the god of death, and restore her husband Satyavan to life. Though not a bodily resurrection in the New Testament sense, it is a story where a mortal effectively secures the return of her husband's life from death's domain. Markandeya. Another legend involves the young sage Markandeya, destined to die at the age of 16. Through fervent worship of Shiva, Markandeya defeats death. Shiva intervenes and grants him immortality. Again, this is more about divine intervention to prevent final death than resurrecting a decayed corpse. But it exemplifies the idea of conquering mortality with divine help. In both cases, the theological and cultural framework is more about reversing a fated or imminent death rather than a resurrection of a long-dead individual. Nonetheless, these stories sometimes get interpreted colloquially as resurrections. B. Hagiographies of saints and sages. While India's spiritual and yogic traditions often depict advanced sages performing wondrous acts, confirmed instances of saints raising the dead are scant and generally not documented with historical rigor. Some stories from medieval Bhakti saints mention miraculous healings or returns from the brink of death. For example, Shirdi Sai Baba, late 19th, early 20th century. Devotees attribute numerous miracles to Sai Baba, including healings that were considered medically impossible, while some devotees claim that he brought individuals who were dead back to life. Historical records mostly indicate critical near-death recoveries rather than true resurrections. Gajanan Maharaj of Shigaon, late 19th, early 20th century. Similar to Sai Baba, hagiographical accounts of Gajanan Maharaj occasionally mention people revived from states of near-death. Again, the line between a near-death revival and a claim of literal resurrection is blurry, and the sources are typically devotional rather than historical scientific. Contextual note. In India, because belief in reincarnation is widespread, the idea of bodily resurrection is less central than in Christian or Islamic traditions. Stories of gods or saints who cheat or conquer death tend to underscore divine grace, spiritual attainment, or the illusory nature of life and death, rather than declare a literal restoration of the same physical body after total death. 2. China. Myths, legends, and the return from the underworld. China's religious and mythological tapestry, spanning Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and folk beliefs, contains themes of immortality, transcendence, and the underworld, DU, but straightforward resurrection stories are relatively rare. Still, a few narratives and folk tales come close. A. Taoist immortals, Xian. Taoist tradition venerates certain enlightened beings or Xian who have achieved immortality through alchemical and spiritual practices. Rather than dying and returning, these sages often undergo a transformation that allows them to leave behind a corpse, sometimes illusory, and ascend into immortality. In some folk stories, if the immortal reappears after being presumed dead, it might be construed as a resurrection, though the conceptual framework is more about transcending death entirely. B. Neja in Chinese mythology. In the popular Chinese mythological tale, Neja is born with extraordinary powers, dies young after a conflict with the Dragon King, and is later revived by the Taoist immortal Taiyi Zhenren, who fashions a new body out of lotus roots. This is indeed a story of bodily revival. Though heavily mythological, it is reminiscent of dismemberment and reassembly myths, like Osiris. Neja's revival underscores key themes in Chinese lore, the power of the immortals and the possibility of transformation beyond mortal limits. C. Folk tales of temporary death and return. Chinese folklore also contains numerous ghost stories and tales of individuals who visit the underworld in dreams or near-death experiences, only to return with warnings or moral lessons. While these are not always framed as resurrections, they demonstrate a fascination with crossing the boundary between life and death. Literary compilations like Pu Songling's Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio, 17th–18th century, include accounts of spirits temporarily reviving corpses, though these are typically cautionary tales or moral allegories rather than historical claims. Contextual note: Confucian thought historically places less emphasis on supernatural miracles and more on moral conduct and ancestral veneration. Taoist and Buddhist traditions incorporate spiritual transformations and rebirths, but the explicit narrative of a dead body physically resurrecting after decomposition is less common than transformations into immortals, illusions, or symbolic returns from the underworld. 3. Africa, traditional beliefs, mythic heroes, and modern claims. Africa's immense cultural and religious diversity yields a variety of stories about death and its reversal. In many traditional belief systems, the boundary between the living and the dead is more permeable than in Western thought. Ancestors, spirits, and deities often interact with the living. However, true bodily resurrection stories are typically rare and often belong to mythic or modern Christian-influenced narratives. A traditional mythic figures. Yoruba mythology, Nigeria, stories of gods, orishas, like Osun, Shango, or Ogun, revolve around their divine attributes and do not usually include an extended death and resurrection arc. Instead, they highlight metamorphosis, possession, or spiritual presence among the living. Congo and Luba mythologies, Central Africa. In some tales, a powerful Nganga, ritual specialist, might restore life to someone who is on the verge of death or bring a semblance of life to a corpse for divination. These stories, however, are often part of the moral or spiritual instruction within the community and less a claim of historically confirmed resurrection. B. Ethiopian Christian traditions. Ethiopia, with one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, has its own hagiographic tradition akin to medieval Europe's. Legends of saints such as Saint Tekle Haymanot or Abun Gebre Menfes Kidus occasionally mention miraculous healings or extraordinary experiences near death. Some local traditions interpret these stories as resurrections, although precise references can be difficult to verify in external historical sources. C. Contemporary Pentecostal and charismatic claims. Modern Africa has also been the setting for sensational resurrection claims, often propagated by certain Pentecostal or charismatic pastors. Daniel Ekechukwu case, Nigeria 2001. Perhaps the most famous recent African claim, in which a Nigerian pastor supposedly came back to life after being declared dead and taken to a mortuary. The claim was promoted by the evangelist Reinhard Bonke. Investigations later raised serious doubts about the thoroughness of the initial death diagnosis and the reliability of witnesses. Still, in some Christian communities, it is regarded as a modern resurrection miracle. Other revivalist movements, across various regions, Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, etc., periodic news stories emerge of pastors who reportedly resurrect individuals during church services. Skeptical investigations often point to the absence of medical documentation, the brief time lapse between death and resurrection, or the possibility of staged events. Contextual note: in many African spiritual worldviews, life and death exist on a continuum of relationships between ancestors and the living. Thus, the phenomenon of return from the dead can sometimes refer to a spirit taking on a new host, or the presence of the ancestors' influence, rather than a literal bodily revival. Contemporary Christian narratives, however, frame these events more in line with biblical miracle stories, often clashing with scientific scrutiny. 4. Summary of resurrection-like motifs in India, China, and Africa. India. Predominant theme is reincarnation or the cyclical nature of samsara, rather than single-event resurrections. Mythic examples, Savitri, Satyavan, Markandeya, show divine intervention, preventing or reversing death in a limited time frame. Some saintly hagiographies mention revival miracles, but historical corroboration is typically lacking. China. Taoist immortals, Xian, avoid death or transform their bodies, a concept distinct from resurrection. Nezha's myth is an example of a bodily recreation by a divine master, bearing parallels to dismemberment and reassembly narratives in other cultures. Folk tales of underworld journeys and returns exist, but they usually serve moral or didactic ends rather than asserting a physically verifiable resurrection. Africa. Traditional mythologies often depict fluid boundaries between life and death, with ancestors, spirits, and deities influencing the living. True bodily resurrections are rare in older myths. Ethiopian Christian tradition has hagiographies with miracle accounts, sometimes interpreted as resurrections. Contemporary Pentecostal claims of resurrecting the dead have garnered media attention, but they typically lack the medical and historical evidence needed to confirm a genuine return from complete, verifiable death. 5. Contextual and scientific observations. Mythic versus historical. Like in the Mediterranean and European contexts, many of these stories fall within the domain of mythology or religious devotion, rather than demonstrable historical fact. Cultural interpretations. In India, the emphasis on cyclic reincarnation shapes how return from death is conceptualized. In Chinese Taoist and Buddhist traditions, transformation or transcendence can be more central than literal bodily revival. African traditional religions often stress a spirit-filled cosmos where ancestors or deities can influence mortal life, making resurrection an elastic concept. Modern scrutiny. In all these cultural contexts, once introduced to scientific medicine and documentation, claims of resurrection face the same challenges as elsewhere, chiefly the lack of credible medical proof of absolute death prior to revival. Concluding note on global resurrection narratives. Across continents and cultures, stories of individuals conquering or circumventing death underscore humanity's deepest questions about mortality and the hope for continued existence. While the specifics vary, whether shaped by reincarnation doctrines, immortality quests, or biblical miracle frameworks, each tradition grapples with how to interpret and narrate extraordinary events that defy normal experience. In India, China, and Africa, as elsewhere, most such claims reside within the realms of myth, legend, or faith-based testimony. Scientific consensus remains that once clinical death and decomposition are confirmed, reversal is biologically impossible. Yet these narratives persist, reinforcing social, moral, or theological lessons and sustaining the perennial human dream of triumph over death.